What have you got for us?
Today I wanted to talk about the Do No Harm Act, and it's a bit of legislation that is a bill to amend the Religious Freedom Restoration Act of 1993 at the federal level. And the idea is to protect the civil rights and otherwise prevent meaningful harm to third parties and for other purposes. So this
Well, that sounds like a good thing.
Yeah, it's a good thing.
Let's protect civil rights.
So it's a failure in that we need this. Okay. Anyway, so that's the kind of the punchline that we're getting to. The Do No Harm Act was introduced earlier in 2017 legislature, and it was reintroduced in the 2019-2020 congressional session. And it was introduced in response to the Hobby Lobby Supreme Court decision where you started having companies use the Religious Freedom Restoration Act to do harm to, in this case, their employees by taking away their, contraceptives under their medical plans. Going back up a little bit, the Religious Freedom Restoration Act was passed nearly unanimously in 1993, back in the Clinton era, and it was an attempt to mitigate government interference in, at that time, Native American religious rituals involving peyote and those sorts of things. And I think the wording was quite a bit broader than it needed to be, and some parts of the law were struck down by the Supreme Court. And since then, many states have their own RFRA, Religious Freedom Restoration Act, which is a terrible name because we're not restoring something. It's a power grab. Texas has an RFRA law that is very broad and more or less says, any time you want to, use your religious beliefs over any sort of law in Texas, you can do so. And I'd like to see some folks challenge that. The Do No Harm Act was created by Representative Joseph P. Kennedy, Bobby Scott, and Kamala Harris, and they have quotes. Joseph Kennedy said, "We cannot be equal or free if our government grants select Americans a license to discriminate against their neighbors under the guise of religious freedom." We all agree with that. By passing the Do No Harm Act, we can reestablish the sacred balance between religious liberty and the personal liberties of those who have too often had their civil rights bargained away. Bobby Scott talks about child labor and abuse cases that have slipped under the RFRA, and Kamala Harris talks about race, gender, sexual orientation, and gender identity, and that there's a potential for discrimination under RFRA. So why is this necessary? Well, the simple reason is because as the majority religion, Christianity, strives to do harm in many cases, and in one case, a federally funded but religious child welfare agency was allowed to place their religious beliefs over the needs of the children and their care. And we think that's a bad thing, because the children should come first, especially if federal money is involved. In another case, a transgender employee was fired because of the religious convictions of the owners of a funeral home. In the Hobby Lobby case, concerned a closely held corporation, religious-based corporation, that was refusing to cover contraceptives for their employees, forcing them to get that on their own. In other cases, we've had attempts to insert a pharmacist's religious convictions in the act of filling prescriptions, and that's very scary. That means that somebody can use religious reason to not fill your prescription or whatever. And of course, this often has to do with either contraceptives or birth control or something like that.
Just 2 weeks ago, I did a debate
on this sort of topic, didn't you?
Yeah, it was how do we deal with the conflict between religious freedoms and LGBT rights? And the video for that, I should have, tomorrow, and it'll be posted up on my channel sometime this week. There were a lot of interesting things that happened during that discussion, including someone in the audience who interrupted a point I was making to correct something before I'd even gotten off and running.
Okay.
And it was funny because I was making an analogy, and she interrupted to correct it, and I was like, if you just bear with me for 30 seconds, you will like what I'm going to say, I promise. And she did, and we got there. it's interesting that this is a failure in the sense that, we set up, I say we, the United States set up special religious protection schemes, essentially. And now when they are clearly recognized as going too far, we're having to kind of say, hang on just a second.
Right.
You can have your religion, you just can't fucking beat people over the head with it.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Right. I think Thomas Jefferson had a really good quote on that. The freedom to swing your arms ends at my nose.
Something like that.
So Christians have been happy to do harm in the past. They have traditionally persecuted and killed Jews. Slavery and the justification of slavery of blacks was based on the curse of Ham or the curse of Canaan. There's been a lot of needless suffering of women in childbirth due to Genesis stupidity. There's been a lot of persecution of gays, lesbians, and transgender people because presumably these folks are not part of the Christian breeding program. There's lots of playing games with birth control and manipulating women to bear children they may not want. The anti-gay aversion therapy or conversion therapy is another example of doing harm. So by their fruits you shall know them. They are out to do harm, and they have been doing harm, and if we give them a long leash, that's what they're going to do. My main problem with the Do No Harm Act is that it doesn't go far enough. It only clarifies the federal RFRA. It doesn't impact the state RFRAs, which are still, as I mentioned, in Texas is very broad. It doesn't impact other laws giving religious favor that may be coming down the pike. And it doesn't really advance the interest of seculars. It's all about, religious belief. And we could claim religious belief, and I think maybe we should for a lot of our fact-based beliefs.
I'll stick with letting the Satanists do that.
Okay.
The Satanists are one of the best allies for the separation of religion and government that we're likely to come across, and we don't have to turn atheism into some kind of religion to achieve those goals.
Well, I've said it before that I think beliefs about religion qualify as religious beliefs.
They qualify as your protected status. You have freedom of religion includes the freedom to not have one.
Yeah.
But it puts us in a different category, much the same way that when we had to do the tax-free status for the building and stuff, we had to do it in a different category than churches do.
But if a law is talking about sincerely held religious beliefs, I don't see why we can't play in that arena.
Yeah, and I don't know why a law would ever talk about sincerely held religious beliefs, because I don't know how you could prove that it was a sincerely held religious belief or why it would matter that it was. Like, it's my sincerely held religious belief that people who believe in the supernatural should not be allowed to vote. And I could make a really good case for that. I won't, because I think it would violate constitutional principles. But it might turn out to be a really good thing.
Right.
And if it's, how could you tell whether or not it is my sincerely held religious belief?
Well, and then there's another problem in that in the Hobby Lobby case, the Supreme Court more or less said, well, any belief you might have might be a religious belief, and it's basically wrote a blank check there.
Yeah.
So it's a pretty scary time as far as these power grabs. So in conclusion, if Christians were out doing good, this law would not be necessary, and it is necessary. So please contact your Congress critter and give it a plug. Urge them to expand the protections for seculars and such, and people who might be victims. And the need for this law points out yet another failure of Christianity.